The Valkoran ambassador had already drawn blood. Not with a blade, with a word. He called Princess Alara Marin of the Terran sovereignty a decorative offering, and he said it loudly enough for every delegate in the Hall of Ascension to hear. The chamber, a cathedral of living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescent veins, went still. 42 species seated in tiered rows of polished bone-white stone, their translators clicking and chirping, and every single one of them turned to watch the human woman at the foot of the dais. Alara did not flinch. She kept her hands folded over the data folio pressed to her abdomen, kept her chin level, kept her breathing measured. The ceremonial gown her mother had chosen, midnight blue Terran silk threaded with silver filament, felt like armor. She needed it to be. The Concord of 12 recognizes the delegation from Earth, the arbiter announced from his hovering pulpit, his four-armed torso draped in white judicial robes. His voice carried the cadence of someone who had opened 10,000 sessions and expected nothing from any of them. Princess Alara Marin, third seat of the Terran sovereignty, will present the amended transit accord. She stepped forward. The crystal floor beneath her boots hummed at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. Somewhere behind the Valkoran section, she caught movement, a tall figure in dark ceremonial armor settling into his seat with the kind of deliberate stillness that drew the eye precisely, because it refused to demand attention. Commander Tavern Solis of the Caliph Dominion. She did not look at him. She could not afford to look at him. Not here. Not with 42 species cataloging every breath she took and an ambassador who had just called her ornamental. Honored delegates. Her voice carried. She had practiced that, had stood in her quarters aboard the Terran frigate Resolute at 3 in the morning, speaking to the walls until her projection filled the room without strain. The amended transit accord addresses 3 points of contention raised during the Shellan session. Terran merchant vessels will submit to dual-origin cargo scans at waypoint 7. Tariff adjustments on medical-grade biologics will follow the Concord sliding index rather than the fixed Terran rate. And the exclusion zone around the Drell Nebula will be extended by 40 parsecs to accommodate Caliph patrol routes. That last concession was the one that mattered. It was the one her mother, Queen Regent Sorin Marin, had authorized after 11 days of encrypted argument. It was also the one that would put Terran ships within sensor range of Caliph defense grids for the first time in 80 years of cold hostility between the two powers. The Valkoran ambassador, a ridge-browed giant named Counselor Dreth whose skin had the color and texture of volcanic glass, leaned forward. The human princess offers Caliph territory she does not own. How generous. A ripple of amusement moved through the chamber. Not laughter, most species present did not laugh the way humans did, but the equivalent. Rustling crests, clicking mandibles, a low harmonic hum from the Seraphine delegation. Alara let it pass. She had been briefed on Dreth. He represented the war faction within the Valkoran hegemony, and the hegemony had spent 6 decades positioning itself as the Concord's enforcement arm. A Terran Caliph rapprochement threatened that position. Everything Dreth said in this chamber was calibrated to prevent it. The exclusion zone adjustment was negotiated with the Caliph Dominion's trade envoy, Alara said. The terms are in the folio distributed to every delegation this morning. Section 4, subsection 9. Dreth's obsidian eyes narrowed. He had not read the folio. She had counted on that. Perhaps, Dreth said, rising to his full height, nearly 3 meters of dense muscle and political theater, the Concord should hear from the Caliph themselves. Or do humans speak for everyone now? The chamber turned, and Alara felt the shift in pressure before she saw him move. Tavern stood. He unfolded from his seat with the economy of motion she had first noticed 6 months ago, during the preliminary talks on Shellan Station, when he had walked into a room full of hostile Terran diplomats and addressed her father's empty chair with more respect than anyone else in the delegation had shown. He was tall for a caliph, broad through the shoulders, his charcoal-gray skin marked with the faint silver lineage scars that traced from his temples to his jaw. His eyes, pale gold, almost luminous in the crystal light, found hers across the chamber and held for exactly 1 second before he looked away. 1 second, she felt it like a handprint on glass. "The Caliph Dominion accepts the amended terms," Tavern said. His voice was low, measured, carrying the formal cadence of a military officer addressing a court. "The exclusion zone adjustment serves mutual security interests. We see no cause for objection." Dreth's jaw tightened, the chamber murmured. Alara exhaled, not visibly, not where anyone could read it as relief, and stepped back from the podium. The arbiter called for the formal vote. She watched the tally climb on the crystal display behind his pulpit, 36 in favor, 4 abstaining, 2 opposed. The Valkoran hegemony and the Thessian Republic voted no. Everyone else fell in line. The transit accord passed. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of what came next. The reception hall adjoined the main chamber through a corridor of arched crystal that filtered the station's artificial daylight into prismatic bands across the floor. Delegates mingled. Drinks were served in vessels calibrated to each species' biochemistry. Alara accepted a glass of something pale green that the steward assured her was safe for human consumption, and moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had attended state functions since she was 14. Her aide, Lieutenant Commander Pell, materialized at her elbow. Pell was compact, sharp-featured, and had served Alara's mother for 15 years before being reassigned to the princess's diplomatic detail. She trusted Pell the way she trusted bulkheads, structurally, without affection. "Dreth is meeting with the Thessian envoy in the South Gallery," Pell murmured. "They're not being subtle about it." "They don't need to be. The vote is done." The vote on the transit accord is done. The ratification summit is in 9 days. Dreth has 9 days to build a coalition to block it. Alara sipped the pale green drink. It tasted like cucumber and static electricity. What does he need? 7 votes to force a review. He has 2. The Thessians give him 3. He needs 4 more, and the Seraphine delegation is wobbling. The Seraphine wobble at everything, which is why Dreth will target them first. Alara set the glass down on a passing tray. She scanned the reception hall, the clusters of delegates, the careful distances maintained between hostile factions, the arbiter's staff circulating with diplomatic immunity and recording devices. And there, near the observation windows that looked out onto the amber curve of the gas giant below, Tavern Soli stood alone. He was watching the planet, or pretending to. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture that of a man accustomed to waiting. The Caliph delegation had dispersed into the crowd, but their commander remained apart, and something about his solitude read as intentional. She should not go to him. Protocol demanded that any Terran Caliph contact occur through formal channels, with aides present and transcripts filed. Her mother had been explicit. The accord was a transaction, not an alliance. Alara was to present the terms, secure the vote, and return to Earth without incident, without entanglement. Without him. She went to him anyway. The observation windows spanned 20 meters of curved crystal, and the gas giant filled them, bands of amber and rust and pale gold churning in slow atmospheric rivers. Tavern did not turn as she approached, but his shoulders shifted a degree, and she knew he had registered her presence the way a soldier registers a change in wind. "Commander Solis." "Princess Marin." She stood beside him, close enough to speak without being overheard, far enough to satisfy any observer that the distance was professional. The crystal filtered the light across both of them, blue on her, gold on him, and for a moment the diplomatic machinery fell away, and they were just 2 people standing at a window, watching a planet turn. "Dreth will move against the ratification," she said. "Yes. You expected that." "I expected him to move before the vote." He waited, That concerns me more. She glanced at him. His profile was sharp. The angular Caliph bone structure, the silver scars, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in command of warships, and the patience required to keep them from firing. He was older than her by a decade, maybe more. Caliph aged differently, and she had never asked. Why does it concern you? Because patience in Dreth is new. Someone is advising him. Someone who understands Concord procedure better than he does. Alara processed that. The Thessians. The Thessians are tools. Whoever is behind Dreth is using them as a screen. He turned his head, and his gold eyes met hers, and the diplomatic distance between them collapsed into something raw and ungovernable. You need to be careful, Alara. Her name, not her title. He had used her name twice before, once on Shelland Station, in a corridor after a session that had run 14 hours, when she had been so exhausted she could barely stand and he had caught her arm to steady her. And once in a secured communication channel, 3 weeks later, when he had contacted her to warn her about a Valkoran intelligence operation targeting Terran diplomatic codes. That call had lasted 4 hours. They had talked about the operation for 20 minutes. The rest had been something else entirely. I am being careful, she said. You are standing next to me at a reception attended by every intelligence service in the Concord. I am standing next to a window, admiring the view. If you happen to be near the same window, that is coincidence. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Caliph did not smile the way humans did. The expression lived in the eyes, in the slight softening of the silver-scarred skin around them. She had learned to read it the way she had learned to read star charts, by repetition, by attention, by wanting to understand. The view is remarkable, he said quietly. She felt the heat in her chest, the dangerous, unmistakable warmth that had no place in a diplomatic corridor, no place in the life of a Terran princess tasked with securing a transit accord, no place between two people whose governments had spent 80 years pointing weapons at each other. 9 days, she said. Dreth has 9 days. And you have 9 days to hold the coalition together. Will the Caliph hold? He looked at her. The question was not about politics, and they both knew it. The Caliph will hold, he said. She nodded. She turned away from the window. She walked back into the reception hall, and every step felt like gravity doubling. Pell was waiting. What did he say? That we should watch for whoever is advising Dreth. And nothing. Alara picked up another glass of the pale green drink. Arrange a meeting with the Seraphine delegation, tomorrow morning before the second session. The Seraphine were a species of slender, translucent-skinned beings whose political structure operated on consensus harmonics. They literally hummed to reach agreement, and the pitch of the hum determined the outcome. Alara had studied their protocols for 3 weeks before the summit. She knew that a low-register approach, calm, unhurried, grounded in mutual benefit, would resonate with their decision-making frequency. A high-register approach, urgency, threat, pressure, would cause them to fragment and abstain. Dreth would use pressure, Alara would use patience. She met with the Seraphine envoy, a being named Tessith whose translucent skin revealed the slow pulse of bioluminescent organs beneath, in a private gallery overlooking the station's arboretum. Tessith listened without interrupting the Seraphine way, while Alara laid out the economic projections for the transit accord. The reduced tariffs, the expanded medical trade routes, the stabilization of the Drell Nebula corridor that the Seraphine used for 60% of their pharmaceutical exports. The Valkoran will argue that the accord empowers the Caliph at the Concord's expense, Tessith said, the words carrying a faint harmonic undertone. The Valkoran will argue whatever serves the Valkoran. Tessith's skin pulsed a slow cerulean. Agreement, Alara thought, or at least consideration. The Seraphine delegation will not abstain on ratification, Tessith said. We will vote in favor, provided the pharmaceutical corridor protections are codified in the final text. They will be. Then we are aligned. 3 votes secured. Dreth needed 4 more beyond his existing 2. Alara left the meeting and found Pell in the corridor outside. Seraphine are locked. Who's next? The Drellin compact. They're nervous about the nebula extension. Set it up. That afternoon, Dreth found her. She was crossing the station's central atrium when the Valkoran counselor stepped into her path. Up close, Dreth was even more imposing, volcanic glass skin shifting in the ambient light, obsidian eyes locked on her with a predator's focus. Princess Marin. His voice was conversational, almost warm. That was worse than the mockery. I hope the Seraphine meeting went well. He knew, of course he knew. It did, Counselor. Thank you for your concern. Curiosity, not concern. He clasped his hands behind his back. I find myself curious why a Terran princess and a Caliph military commander, from governments that have pointed weapons at each other for 80 years, keep finding themselves in the same rooms at the same moments. Alara met his eyes. Curiosity is a fine quality, Counselor. I recommend satisfying it by reading the Accord's terms. Most questions, yes. Dreth inclined his massive head, technically a bow, functionally a dismissal, and walked away. Pell materialized at her side. He is not probing, Alara said, watching Dreth's retreating form cross the atrium bridge. He is announcing. The message is not for me, it is for the delegation still deciding. We move faster, set up the Drellin and signal the Korathi, make him spread his attention. The next 4 days were a siege. Alara moved through the Concord station like a chess piece, navigating a board where every square could shift, meetings in private galleries, encrypted calls to Earth for authorization on minor concessions, meals taken standing up in her quarters while Pell briefed her on the latest vote counts. She slept in fragments. She dreamed in Caliph. On the 3rd day, she found the leak. Pell woke her at 400 station time with a datapad glowing red, priority alert. Someone had accessed the Terran delegation's internal briefing files through a compromised terminal in the station's auxiliary communications hub. The breach was surgical. Only the negotiation strategy documents had been copied, the files outlining which delegations Alara planned to approach and in what order. Dreth, Alara asked, pulling a jacket over her sleep clothes. The access codes traced to a Theshan maintenance contractor, but the download packet was routed through a Valkoran diplomatic relay. So Dreth has our playbook. He has yesterday's playbook. I rotated the approach sequence after the Seraphine meeting. Alara stared at her aide. You anticipated this. Your mother anticipated this. She told me to run 2 strategy tracks from the start, one real, one for anyone who might be listening. Pell's sharp features carried the faintest trace of satisfaction. Dreth now believes you will approach the Korathi delegation next. You will actually approach the Drellin. And the Korathi will receive a courtesy call from the Terran trade envoy, enough to make Dreth think his intelligence is accurate, not enough to close anything. By the time he realizes you've locked the Drellin, he will have wasted 2 days on the wrong target. Alara exhaled. Her mother. Even from the other side of the galaxy, the Queen Regent was playing the board 3 moves ahead. There is a complication, Pell added. The breach means someone on this station is actively working for the Valkoran inside our communications perimeter. Not remotely, physically present, with access to our auxiliary systems. Find them. I have 2 security officers on it. But the station has 11,000 occupants, and the Concord's privacy protocols limit our surveillance authority. Then work within the limits, quietly. The breach changed the texture of the days that followed. Every meeting carried a second layer, not just what Alara said to each delegation, but what she allowed to be overheard, what she left on terminals she knew might be monitored, what breadcrumbs she scattered for whoever was feeding Dreth his intelligence. It was exhausting. It was also, in a way she had not expected, clarifying. The breach stripped away the pretense that this was a polite diplomatic exercise. It was a fight. Dreth was fighting to preserve the Valkoran hegemony's dominance, and Alara was fighting to end 80 years of cold hostility, and the only question was which of them would run out of ground first. On the afternoon of the third day, the Korathi delegation's senior envoy approached Alara in the station's commissary, a neutral space where delegations mingled over food calibrated to their biochemistry. The Korathi were a stocky, copper-skinned species with deep-set amber eyes and a reputation for blunt pragmatism. "The Valkoran have offered us a defense pact," the Korathi envoy said without preamble, "in exchange for opposing ratification." Alara set down her tray. "And you are telling me this because?" "Because the Korathi do not accept defense pacts from governments that spy on their allies." The envoy's amber eyes were flat, unreadable. "We intercepted a Valkoran intelligence probe targeting Korathi communications 2 days ago. We chose not to make it public, but we are not inclined to partner with people who read our messages while offering us handshakes." Alara felt the ground shift beneath her. Dreth had overreached. He had not limited his intelligence operations to the Terran delegation. He had been probing everyone, and the Korathi had caught him. "The Korathi will support ratification?" she asked. "The Korathi will support ratification. And we will remember who dealt with us honestly." The envoy picked up a copper-colored fruit from the commissary display, nodded once, and walked away. 4 more votes. Dreth's coalition was crumbling faster than he could build it. She did not see Tavern again until the 4th day. It happened in the station's archival wing, a vast, dimly lit repository of Concord treaties and historical records stored in crystal matrices that hummed faintly in the silence. Alara had gone there to retrieve a precedent for the Drellin negotiation, a 70-year-old corridor agreement that established the legal framework she needed. The archival wing was empty at that hour. Almost. Tavern was standing at one of the crystal access terminals, his fingers moving across the interface with the fluid precision of someone who had searched these records before. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face, surprise layered over something deeper, something he kept behind his gold eyes like a fire behind a grate, made her stop in the doorway. "You are looking for the Drellin precedent," he said. "How did you know?" "Because I am looking for it too. The Drellin envoy contacted the Caliph delegation this morning. They want assurance that the Nebula extension will not impede their mining rights." "It will not." "I know that. They need to hear it from someone who is not Caliph." She walked to the terminal beside his. The crystal matrices cast a pale blue glow across both of them, and the archival wing was so quiet she could hear him breathe. She called up the precedent Treaty of Drell, year 3714 of the Concord calendar, and scrolled through the relevant sections. "Section 12, she said. "Mining easements within extended exclusion zones are preserved under original compact terms. The Drellin can keep their operations." "Good," he paused. His jaw worked, the silver scars shifting along the bone. "Alara." She closed her eyes. "Don't." "I am not doing anything." "You are saying my name in a room where we are alone, and you know what that means." Silence. The crystal hummed. "What it means," he said carefully, "is that I am a Caliph military commander standing in an archive with a Terran princess, and we are both here for the same treaty, and neither of us has done anything wrong." "Not yet." The word hung between them. She opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression she had seen exactly once before, on Shellen Station, in the corridor, when his hand had been on her arm and his face had been close enough for her to count the silver scars. "The Valkoran breached our communications," she said, redirecting. It was the only weapon she had against the pull between them, information, duty, the work. "They have our strategy files." His expression shifted. The personal retreated behind the professional, and the Caliph military commander surfaced. When? Sometime in the last 48 hours. We caught it this morning. The access codes route through a Theshan contractor, but the relay is Valkorin. That confirms the advisor. Someone with operational intelligence experience is running Dreth's campaign, not a diplomat, a handler. Can you identify them? I will make inquiries through Caliph intelligence channels. Quietly, he looked at her. And you should know the Caliph ruling council received a private communique from the Valkorin hegemony yesterday. An offer. If the Caliph withdraws support for the transit accord, the Valkorin will cede patrol rights in the outer rim sectors. Alara's chest tightened. That is a significant concession. It is a bribe. The outer rim sectors are disputed territory that the Valkorin cannot hold without Concord backing. They would be giving us something they are already losing. Your ruling council knows that. My ruling council knows what I tell them. His gold eyes held hers. I told them the accord is sound, and the Terran delegation's commitment is genuine, and the exclusion zone adjustment serves the Dominion's long-term security. They accepted my assessment. Because they trust you, she thought. Because you have earned their trust the same way you earned mine, by saying what is true and doing what is right and never flinching from either. Ilara, what is happening between us? Cannot happen. It is already happening. She turned to face him fully. The crystal light caught the silver threading in her gown, caught the gold in his eyes, and she felt the collision of everything she wanted against everything she owed. She was the third seat of the Terran sovereignty. He was the military arm of the Caliph Dominion. Their governments were signing a transit accord, not a peace treaty. The accord was a thread, a single fragile filament spanning 80 years of hostility. If it snapped, it would not be rebuilt. And if anyone in the Concord learned that a Terran princess and a Caliph commander had formed an attachment, a personal, undeniable, ungovernable attachment, that thread would snap. Dreth would see to it. He would use it to discredit the accord, to paint it as a back-channel deal brokered through seduction rather than policy. The Valkorin propaganda machine would turn their connection into a weapon, and the accord would die, and the exclusion zone would harden, and the Cold War would resume with fresh fuel. It cannot happen, she said again, and her voice broke on the second word, and she hated herself for it. Tavrin did not reach for her. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his gold eyes holding hers with a steadiness that made her chest ache. Then tell me to leave, he said. She could not. He nodded, a slow, grave inclination of his head that carried more weight than any words he could have spoken. Then he turned back to the terminal, called up the Drellin precedent, and transferred the relevant sections to her data folio without being asked. Section 12, he said, for the Drellin. She took the folio. Their fingers did not touch. The space between them, 12 inches of archival air, felt like the exclusion zone itself. She left. She did not look back. She held her composure through the corridor, through the transit hub, through the door of her quarters. Then she sat on the edge of her bunk and pressed her hands to her face and breathed until the shaking stopped. Pell found her 20 minutes later, dry-eyed and reviewing the Drellin precedent on her datapad. The Caliph commander was in the archive, Pell said, not a question. He was retrieving the same document. Convenient. Accurate. Pell studied her for a long moment. Then, the Valkorin intelligence attaché has been monitoring the archival wing's access logs. Every terminal session is time-stamped and cross-referenced. Dreth will know you were in the same room. Alara's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice level. We were retrieving the same treaty. The timestamps will show that we access different terminals. They will also show that you were alone together for 11 minutes. 11 minutes reviewing a 70-year-old mining easement is not a scandal. In this Concord, 11 minutes alone between a Terran and a Caliph is exactly a scandal. Alara set the datapad down. Then we ensure the Drellin vote is locked before Dreth can use it. On the 5th day, Pell's security officers found the mole. A junior communications technician embedded in the Concord's neutral staff, ostensibly a member of the station's infrastructure team, but carrying Valcorin-issued encrypted hardware concealed inside a standard maintenance toolkit. The technician had been accessing Terran auxiliary systems during routine station maintenance rounds, copying files during the 60-second windows when the system cycled its authentication protocols. Pell brought the evidence to Alara in a sealed data case. We cannot arrest him. He is under Concord neutral staff protection, but we can present the evidence to the Arbiter's office and have his access revoked. Do it, and make sure Dreth knows we found him. That will tip our hand. That is the point. Dreth needs to understand that his intelligence operation has failed. It changes his calculation. He will have to rely on procedure alone, and procedure is where we are strongest. The Drellin came around on the 6th day. Alara presented the precedent in a joint session with the Caliph trade envoy, not Tavrin, deliberately not Tavrin, and the Drellin Compact's 3 voting delegates confirmed their support for ratification. That brought the coalition to 38 in favor, with the Valcorin hegemony and the Theshan Republic still opposed and 2 delegations undecided. The Arbiter's office quietly revoked the compromised technician's access credentials that same afternoon. Within hours, the Valcorin delegation filed a formal protest, which the Arbiter dismissed. Dreth was running out of back channels. On the 7th day, Dreth moved. He filed a formal challenge with the Arbiter's office, a procedural objection claiming that the exclusion zone amendment had been negotiated outside Concord oversight, in bilateral channels that violated the Concord's transparency charter. The specific allegation, that the Terran Third Seat and the Caliph military commander had conducted undisclosed negotiations in private, and that the accord's terms reflected a personal arrangement rather than a policy consensus. The accusation was precise. It was also, in the most technical sense, adjacent to truth. Alara and Tavrin had spoken privately, in corridors, at windows, in archives. They had not negotiated the accord's terms in those conversations, but the appearance of private contact between the 2 delegations whose accord was being ratified was enough to trigger a formal review. The Arbiter called an emergency session. Alara stood at the podium again, but this time the crystal chamber felt like a courtroom. The challenge requires a response from both the Terran and Caliph delegations, the Arbiter said. The Concord's Transparency Charter, Article 7, requires that all bilateral negotiations relevant to a pending accord be disclosed in full. Counselor Dreth alleges that undisclosed contacts occurred between Princess Marin and Commander Solis. Princess Marin, do you wish to respond? Alara looked out at the chamber. 42 delegations. Dreth stood in the Valcorin section, his volcanic glass face impassive, his obsidian eyes fixed on her with the patience Tavrin had warned her about. Behind him, the Theshan envoy. To the left, the Seraphine delegation, Tessith's translucent skin flickering with anxious bioluminescence. The Drellin, the Arbiter's staff, and there in the Caliph section, Tavrin. Sitting upright, his expression carved from the same stone as the chamber walls, his gold eyes on hers. She could deny it. She could claim that every contact with Commander Solis had been incidental and unrelated to the accord. The timestamps would be ambiguous enough to support that reading. Her diplomatic training, 15 years of it, told her to minimize, deflect, and redirect. But Dreth had not built this challenge on timestamps alone. She saw it now, the architecture of his attack. He had been patient because he had been building something. The Valcorin intelligence attaché had been monitoring the archival wing, the observation gallery, the corridors, the reception hall. Dreth had surveillance data. He had sensor logs showing proximity. He had the compromised communications. Even with the mole exposed, the files already copied would have revealed patterns of Terran-Caliph coordination that exceeded formal channels. He had enough to create doubt, and in the Concord, doubt was sufficient. If she denied and Dreth produced evidence, the denial itself became the scandal. The Accord would die. The coalition would fracture. 80 years of Cold War would resume. If she admitted to private contact and claimed it was unrelated to the Accord, Dreth would argue that any private contact between the principals constituted undisclosed negotiation. The distinction was too fine for a chamber primed to be suspicious. There was a third option. It was the one she had been circling for 7 days, the one she had pressed her hands to her face to avoid, the one that Pell would call reckless and her mother would call catastrophic, and Dreth would never see coming because it violated every assumption he had built his challenge on. She looked at Tavrin, he looked at her. And in his gold eyes she saw something she had never seen in a Caliph face, not composure, not calculation, not the disciplined stillness of a military officer. She saw fear. He was afraid for her. He was afraid of what she might do, and he was afraid that he could not stop it, and the fear was braided with something fiercer that he had never spoken aloud because speaking it would have been the end of everything careful and calibrated and contained. She turned back to the chamber. Counselor Dreth's challenge rests on the assumption that my contact with Commander Solis was a negotiating channel, she said. Her voice carried. She did not need to practice anymore. It was not. Dreth leaned forward. Then what was it, Princess? The chamber waited. Ilara set the data folio down on the podium. She placed both hands flat on the crystal surface and felt the hum travel through her bones. Commander Solis and I have spoken privately on several occasions during this summit and prior to it. Those conversations were not negotiations. They were not diplomatic back channels. They were not related to the transit accord or the exclusion zone or the tariff adjustments. She paused. They were personal. The chamber erupted. Not in sound, most species did not erupt the way humans did, but in motion. Crests rose. Mandibles clicked. The Seraphine delegation's collective bioluminescence spiked to a sharp violet. The Arbiter's staff exchanged glances. Dreth's obsidian eyes widened by a fraction, the Valkorian equivalent of a shout. Personal, Dreth repeated. The human princess admits to a personal relationship with the Caliph military commander, whose government is party to the accord she authored. I admit to a personal connection. I state, under the Concord's truth protocols, that the connection had no bearing on the accord's terms. The terms were negotiated by my government's trade office and the Caliph Dominion's trade envoy through official channels, with full Concord oversight. Every document, every communication, every draft is in the record. The exclusion zone adjustment was authorized by Queen Regent Sorin Marin and approved by the Caliph Dominion's ruling council. Commander Solis did not negotiate it. I did not negotiate it with him. The accord stands on its own merits. And yet you expect this chamber to believe that a personal entanglement between the principals did not influence. I expect this chamber to read the record. Ilara's voice sharpened. Every term in this accord was proposed, debated, amended, and finalized in sessions attended by Concord oversight officials. The timestamps are in the folio. The oversight reports are in the Arbiter's archive. Counselor Dreth himself accessed our delegation's internal strategy documents through a compromised communications technician, a breach the Arbiter's office has already documented. If anyone has operated outside the Concord's transparency charter, it is not the Terran delegation. Dreth's volcanic glass face went rigid. He had not expected her to name the breach publicly. The chamber's attention pivoted to him, 42 delegations recalculating who was operating in bad faith. Ilara pressed the opening. If Counselor Dreth believes the terms are flawed, let him challenge the terms. If he believes the oversight was insufficient, let him challenge the oversight. But he is not challenging the terms or the oversight. He is challenging the character of the people who presented them, because the terms are sound and the oversight was thorough, and the only weapon he has left is innuendo. Dreth stood motionless. The chamber was still. Ilara turned to the arbiter. I request that the challenge be decided on the record. Let the Concord review every document, every communication, every oversight report. If any term in this accord was influenced by an undisclosed private arrangement, I will withdraw it myself. The arbiter's 4 arms folded across his chest. He studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to the chamber. The Concord will review the record. A panel of 3 neutral delegations will examine the negotiation timeline and report their findings within 48 hours. Until then, the ratification vote is suspended. 2 days. Dreth had bought himself 2 days. But Ilara had taken his weapon and turned it into a scalpel. The review would examine the record, and the record was clean. She knew it was clean because she had insisted on Concord oversight at every stage precisely, because she had known, from the first conversation on Shellen Station, from the first moment his gold eyes had met hers, that this day would come. She had planned for this. She had planned for it the way a soldier plans for a siege, by building walls before the enemy arrives, every formal session logged, every communication filed, every term negotiated through channels that could withstand scrutiny. She had done it because she was a princess trained to protect her government's interests. She had done it because she was her mother's daughter. And she had done it because she loved him, and loving him meant ensuring that their connection could never be used to destroy the thing they both believed in. The 48 hours were the longest of her life. She spent them in her quarters, reviewing documents with Pell running projections, fielding encrypted calls from Earth. Her mother's face on the screen, Queen Regent Sorin Marin, iron-haired, steel-eyed, the woman who had held the Terran sovereignty together through 2 succession crises and a border war, carried an expression Ilara had never seen before. "You told them," her mother said. "I told them the truth. You told 42 species that the Terran third seat has a personal connection with a Caliph military commander." "Yes." Silence, the encrypted channel hummed. "Is it real?" her mother asked. Ilara looked at the woman who had raised her to negotiate before she could drive, to read a room before she could read a novel, to carry the weight of a government on her shoulders before she had grown into them. "Yes," she said, "it is real." Her mother closed her eyes. When she opened them, the steel was still there, but beneath it, deep beneath it, in the place where queens kept the things that policy could not touch, there was something else. Something that looked like grief or pride or both. "The record is clean?" her mother asked. "Every document, every timestamp, every oversight report." "Then the review will clear you." "Yes." "And after that?" "After that, the accord is ratified. The exclusion zone is adjusted. Terran ships enter the corridor. The Cold War thaws. That is what matters." "That is not what I asked." Ilara pressed her hands together in her lap. "After that, I do not know." Her mother studied her through the screen. "Your father would have understood," she said quietly. "He was not good at keeping his heart out of his work either." The call ended. Ilara sat in silence for a long time. On the second day of the review, Tavrin requested a formal audience through the arbiter's office, proper channels, a neutral meeting room, an arbiter's observer present. Pell arranged it with visible relief. The room was small and functional, polished stone walls, a crystal table, 2 chairs, and the observer seated in the corner with a recording device. Tavrin entered in full ceremonial armor. Ilara wore the midnight blue gown. They sat across from each other with the table between them like a demilitarized zone. "The Caliph Dominion wishes to make a formal statement regarding the review," Tavrin said, his voice pitched for the recorder. "The Terran delegation is listening." The Caliph Ruling Council has reviewed the Transit Accord's negotiation timeline independently. Our assessment concurs with what Princess Marin stated in the chamber. The Accord's terms were negotiated through established channels, with Concord oversight, and reflect policy consensus. The personal connection Princess Marin disclosed had no bearing on the terms. The Caliph Dominion stands by the Accord, and by the integrity of both delegations. The formality of it, the precision, the care with which every word was chosen to support her without compromising either government, hit her harder than any private word he had ever spoken. He was protecting the Accord by protecting her, and he was doing it in the most Tavern way possible, through discipline, through duty, through the meticulous exercise of exactly the right authority at exactly the right moment. The Terran delegation acknowledges the Caliph Dominion's statement and reciprocates in full, she said. They looked at each other across the crystal table. The observer's recording device hummed softly. And everything that could not be said in a monitored room with a witness present lived in the silence between them. A silence that was, somehow, more honest than words. The meeting concluded. They stood. As Tavern turned to leave, he paused at the door. He did not look back. He said quietly, in the formal cadence he had maintained throughout, "The Caliph Dominion values its relationship with the Terran sovereignty. Deeply." The word deeply carried everything. The observer would hear a diplomatic courtesy. Alara heard the ocean beneath it. The review panel delivered their findings the following morning. The record was clean. Every term in the Transit Accord had been negotiated through formal channels, with full Concord oversight. The exclusion zone adjustment had been proposed by the Terran Trade Office, approved by the Caliph Ruling Council, and reviewed by 3 independent Concord assessors before being presented to the chamber. Commander Solis had not participated in any negotiating session. Princess Marin had not communicated any Accord-related proposals to Commander Solis through private channels. The archival wing contact, 11 minutes, adjacent terminals, the Drellin precedent, was consistent with independent research on the same document. Furthermore, the panel noted the documented breach of Terran communications through a Valcorin-linked intelligence asset, and recommended that the Arbiter's Office investigate the Valcorin hegemony's compliance with the Concord's Transparency Charter. The panel finds no evidence that the Accord's terms were influenced by undisclosed private arrangements, the Seraphine envoy announced. Tessith's translucent skin pulsed a calm, steady blue. The challenge is without merit. Dreth stood. For a moment, Alara thought he would press the attack, file an appeal, demand an extended review, stall the ratification until the coalition fractured under its own weight. His obsidian eyes swept the chamber, calculating. But the counter-finding on the intelligence breach had shifted the chamber's suspicion from the Terran delegation to the Valcorin. Pushing further would deepen the damage to the hegemony's standing. The Valcorin hegemony withdraws its challenge, Dreth said. The words landed like stones dropping into deep water. The Arbiter called the ratification vote. Alara stood at the podium for the last time. The crystal chamber hummed around her and the tally climbed on the display, 39 in favor, 2 abstaining, 1 opposed. The Thessians had shifted to abstention. Only the Valcorin hegemony voted no. The Transit Accord was ratified. The chamber broke into motion, delegates rising, aides converging, the diplomatic machinery of 42 species grinding forward into the new reality the Accord had created. Alara gathered her data folio, exchanged formal courtesies with the Arbiter, accepted the congratulations of the Seraphine and Drellin delegations. And then, because every part of her that was careful and calibrated and contained had reached its limit, she looked across the chamber to where Tavern Solis stood. He was watching her. He was not pretending to watch the planet or the crystal or the vote tally. He was watching her with his gold eyes and his silver-scarred face and his hands clasped behind his back, and the expression he wore was the one she had seen in the archive, the fire behind the grate, but the grate was open now, and the fire was visible, and it was enormous, and it was quiet. She crossed the chamber. She walked through clusters of delegates and aides and translators, past Dreth's volcanic glass stare, past Pell's sharp intake of breath, past every protocol and procedure and carefully maintained diplomatic distance that had governed her life since the day she first put on a gown with silver threading and stood in a room full of strangers and pretended she belonged there. She stopped in front of him. The chamber did not fall silent the way it does in stories. It went on, conversations, movement, the machinery of consensus. But the space around them contracted, and the delegates nearest to them paused, and a ripple of attention spread outward like a stone dropped into the still water of the Concord's collective awareness. "Commander Solis," she said. "Princess Marin." She looked up at him. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head, and the crystal light caught the silver scars along his jaw, and his gold eyes were steady and warm and full of something she had spent 7 days trying not to name. "The accord is ratified," she said. "I've heard. The record is clean." "I know." Dreth's challenge failed. "It was always going to fail. You built the record. You planned for this." "I planned for the challenge. I did not plan for everything." He studied her. Around them the ripple of attention widened. A Seraphine delegate's skin flickered. The arbiter's aide paused with a data folio half raised. Dreth, across the chamber, turned to watch. "What did you not plan for?" Tavrin asked. She felt the crystal hum beneath her feet. She felt the weight of 42 species' attention settling on her shoulders like the midnight blue gown she wore. She felt the gravity of what she was about to do, the diplomatic consequence, the political risk, the interstellar implications of a Terran princess standing in the heart of the Concord and saying what she was about to say. She felt all of it, and then she let it go. "I choose him," she whispered. The words were quiet. They were meant for him, for his gold eyes and his silver scars and his steady, unwavering presence that had anchored her through 7 days of siege and 6 months of careful, agonizing, beautiful restraint. But the Concord's acoustics were designed to carry. The crystal amplified, the translators clicked. And the whisper, 3 words, spoken by a human princess to a Caliph commander in the heart of the greatest diplomatic assembly in the galaxy, reached every delegation in the chamber. Every throne in the Concord fell silent. Not the manufactured silence of diplomatic protocol, not the calculating pause of a chamber assessing leverage. A real silence, the kind that falls when something true is spoken in a room built for negotiation, and the room does not know what to do with truth. Tavrin's gold eyes glistened. The Caliph did not cry the way humans did, but the luminescence in his irises brightened, a biological response to overwhelming emotion, and the silver scars along his jaw caught the light, and his composure held the way a dam holds, perfectly, until you saw the hairline fracture where the water was already coming through. He unclasped his hands. He brought one hand forward slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything, and extended it, palm up, in the Caliph gesture of binding oath. It was not a handshake. It was not a proposal. It was older than both, a warrior's promise, offered without condition, without reservation, without the careful diplomatic machinery that governed every other interaction in the chamber. She placed her hand in his. The crystal chamber erupted, not in protest, not in applause, but in the cascading murmur of 42 species processing what they had just witnessed. Crests rose and fell. Bioluminescent skin pulsed through the visible spectrum. Mandibles clicked in rapid conference. The arbiter's 4 arms unfolded in a gesture that could have been surprise or benediction or both. Dreth turned and walked out of the chamber. He did not speak. He did not need to. The transit accord was ratified. The challenge had failed. And the thing he had tried to use as a weapon, the personal connection between a Terran princess and a Caliph commander, had just been declared openly, publicly, irrevocably, in a room that could never unchoose to have heard it. Pell appeared at Alara's side. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but her eyes, sharp, quick, calculating, moved between Alara and Tavrin and the chamber, and the exits with the speed of someone revising every contingency plan she had ever written. "Your mother will want to call," Pell said. "I know. The Valkoran propaganda channels will be active within the hour." "I know. The Concord's media registry has 17 requests for comment already." "I know." Pell looked at Tavrin. Tavrin looked at Pell. Something passed between them, an assessment, a mutual recognition of the tectonic shift that had just occurred and the aftershocks that would follow. "Commander Solis," Pell said, "I trust your delegation has a communications office." "We do." "Then I suggest our offices coordinate before the narrative is written for us." Tavrin inclined his head, agreed. Pell nodded once, crisply, efficiently, the nod of a woman who had just watched a princess rewrite interstellar relations in 3 words and was already planning the next move, and withdrew to begin making calls. Alara stood in the crystal chamber with Tavrin's hand in hers, and the Concord shifting around them like the bands of the gas giant outside the observation windows, vast, slow, irreversible. "You did not plan for this," Tavrin said quietly. "No. What happens now?" She looked up at him, the gold light in his eyes, the silver scars. The face she had learned to read the way she read star charts, by repetition, by attention, by wanting to understand. "Now we build something," she said. "Not a transit accord, not an exclusion zone, something that holds even when people like Dreth try to break it. That is a large ambition for 2 people standing in a crystal room. We are not 2 people standing in a crystal room. We are a Terran princess and a Caliph commander who just told 42 species that this is real. That changes the equation." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the softening came, the slight shift around his gold eyes, the easing of the silver-scarred skin, the Caliph expression she had learned to read as the thing humans called a smile. "It does change the equation," he said. The reception that followed was nothing like the one that had preceded it. The careful distances had collapsed. Delegates approached them, some with curiosity, some with congratulations, some with the calculating assessment of politicians recalibrating their positions in light of new information. The Seraphine envoy hummed a note that Tessith later told her was their word for courage. The Drellin delegation offered a formal mining rights concession as a gesture of goodwill toward the new Terran Caliph alignment. Even the Theshan envoy, hedging their bets, murmured something about admiring directness. The Korathi envoy, the stocky, copper-skinned pragmatist who had warned Alara about the Valkoran defense pact in the commissary, crossed the reception floor and stood before them both. The envoy's amber eyes moved from Alara to Tavrin and back. "The Korathi have a saying," the envoy said. "A bridge built by 2 hands holds more weight than one built by 1,000 engineers." The envoy paused. "We did not understand what kind of bridge you were building. Now we do." The envoy extended a closed fist, the Korathi gesture of formal respect, and opened it palm upward, revealing nothing. Empty hand. No weapon, no contract, no leverage. Just trust offered freely. Alara placed her hand over the envoy's open palm. Tavrin placed his over Alara's. 3 species, 3 hands, in the middle of a reception hall where 80 years of hostility had just cracked along its fault line. The envoy nodded once, withdrew, and disappeared into the crowd. No fanfare, no speeches, just a copper-skinned pragmatist who recognized a structural change when one walked through the door. Tavrin stayed at her side through all of it. Not behind her, not ahead of her, beside her, the way he had been since Shellan Station, since the corridor, since the hand on her arm and the 4-hour call and every careful, agonizing, beautiful moment that had led to this. Pell returned twice during the evening, once to report that the Valkoran propaganda channels had predictably begun framing the declaration as evidence of a back-channel conspiracy, and once to report that 13 Concord delegations had issued counterstatements affirming the review panel's findings and the Accord's integrity. The narrative was being written, and for once, the truth was winning. 13 counterstatements, Pell said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone determined not to show surprise. In 6 hours, that does not happen in the Concord. It happened today, Alara said. Pell studied her for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of her professional composure softened, just enough for Alara to see the human being underneath the lieutenant commander. Your mother chose well when she assigned me to you, Pell said. I did not believe that at the time. And now? Pell looked at Tavrin, who was listening with the careful attention of a man learning the internal dynamics of a team he was about to join. Now I believe she knew something I did not. Late that evening, when the reception had finally thinned and the crystal chamber had dimmed to a low amber glow, Alara stood at the observation windows one last time. The gas giant turned below, amber and rust and pale gold, unchanged, unhurried, indifferent to the small dramas of the species that orbited it. Tavrin stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the quiet, steady, unwavering certainty that he was there. My mother said my father would have understood, Alara said. Your father. He was not good at keeping his heart out of his work either. Tavrin looked at her, the gold eyes, the silver scars, the warrior who had walked into a room full of hostile diplomats and treated an empty chair with respect. I do not think that is a failing, he said. She leaned into his shoulder, just barely, just enough to feel the contact through the fabric of her gown and the plates of his armor. It was not a kiss. It was not an embrace. It was the smallest possible gesture of recognition, one person leaning toward another in a crystal room at the edge of a gas giant, while the galaxy reorganized itself around the simple, ungovernable fact that they had chosen each other. No, she said, neither do I. The transit accord held. The exclusion zone was adjusted. Terran ships entered the corridor for the first time in 80 years, and Calith patrol vessels escorted them through, and the Cold War that had defined a generation began the slow, difficult, extraordinary process of thawing. Dreth returned to the Valkoran hegemony and filed a formal protest with his own government. He was reassigned within the month. The Thessian Republic signed a bilateral trade agreement with the Terran sovereignty 6 weeks later, a small thing, but a thing that would not have existed before. The Concord registered the personal declaration of Princess Alara Marin and Commander Tavrin Solis in its archives, filed under Article 12, Section 9, Formal Cross-Species Personal Bonds of Record. It was the 14th such bond in the Concord's 3,000-year history, the first between a Terran and a Caliph. Alara did not return to Earth immediately. There were sessions to attend, protocols to formalize, the careful work of turning a whispered declaration into the framework for something durable. Tavrin's delegation extended their stay. They worked side by side at terminals, in galleries, at observation windows, building the thing she had promised, something that held. On the morning she finally boarded the Terran frigate Resolute for the journey home, Tavrin walked her to the docking corridor. The crystal walls hummed around them. The station's artificial daylight filtered through in prismatic bands, blue on her, gold on him, the same light that had fallen across them the first time they stood at a window together. He extended his hand, palm up, the binding oath. She placed her hand in his. I will see you at the next session, she said. You will see me before that. She looked at him. The Caliph Dominion is sending a diplomatic liaison to Earth. The Caliph Dominion is sending me. The fracture in the dam widened. She felt the water coming through, not tears, not yet, but the pressure of everything she had held back, everything she had planned for and not planned for, everything she had built and risked and chosen. "Then I will see you soon," she said. He brought her hand up, not to his lips, not in any gesture that could be called intimate by the Concord's monitoring systems or the Valkoran's surveillance apparatus, but to the level of his heart, and he held it there, and the gold in his eyes burned like the gas giant below, vast and slow and full of light. "Soon," he said. She boarded the Resolute. The airlock closed. The frigate disengaged from the station and angled toward the corridor that Terran ships could now travel for the first time in 80 years. Through the viewport, the Concord station shrank, a lattice of living crystal against the amber curve of the planet, holding treaties and archives and 42 species worth of careful, calibrated, ungovernable hope. Pell appeared beside her. "Your mother is on the encrypted channel. Tell her I will call in 10 minutes. She says it is urgent." "It is always urgent." Pell paused. Then, with the faintest crack in her professional composure, "She says she is proud of you." Alara looked at Pell. Pell looked at the viewport. 10 minutes, Alara said. She stood at the viewport alone, watching the station recede, watching the corridor open before her, watching the vast and patient universe make room for the thing she had chosen. 3 words whispered in a crystal room, 3 words that had changed the equation. She pressed her hand to the viewport glass, cool, smooth, solid, and felt the hum of the engines carrying her forward. It was enough. It was the beginning.